Her billionaire husband slammed divorce papers on the table and said his mistress deserved this mansion more than she ever did. And in that single moment, the life Grace Rockwell had quietly tolerated for years split open like glass under pressure.
Is
The
this what
force
you
of the
really
papers
want?
hitting the
Fine.
polished walnut surface echoed through the estate her ancestors built,
Yes,
a
I
place
don't need
carved
you
from
anymore.
old money dignity that Ethan Rockwell never truly understood. His words carried the smirking confidence of a man who believed cruelty was a form of power and humiliation a form of victory. To Ethan, this was his triumphant announcement, the climax of a story he thought belonged solely to him. What he didn't realize was that this exact moment would become the opening scene of his downfall. Before we watch Ethan lose everything, subscribe and tell me in the comments, do you think silence is weakness or is it strategy? Grace didn't touch the papers. She didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't lower her gaze. She simply sat in her father's old chair, the embroidered arms resting beneath her fingertips like familiar allies. Ethan searched her face with the eager cruelty of someone expecting to see devastation. But there was none, and that absence unsettled him more than he allowed himself to admit. He chuckled instead, pacing with the swagger of a man performing for an invisible audience, as if cameras were rolling and he was the star delivering a final, unforgettable line. He gestured at the vaulted ceilings, the ornate chandeliers, the oil portraits watching him with the cold judgment of Whitmore ancestors. He boasted that his mistress appreciated him more than Grace ever had. He said the mansion deserved joy, passion, youth, things he claimed Grace had denied him. To him, the mansion was a trophy, something to gift as proof of his own desirability. But if he paid attention, if he listened, really listened, he would have noticed that the house itself almost seemed to withdraw from him. Its history did not belong to Ethan. It tolerated him. For now, Grace's silence grew heavier, taking on a texture, a shape, a presence he couldn't overpower. He always misunderstood her quietness, assuming it meant passivity. He thought she swallowed her pride because she lacked ambition, lacked courage, lacked options. But today, that stillness served a new purpose. It revealed the limits of his understanding. The louder Ethan became, the more obvious it was that he had no idea what forces were silently working against him. He leaned in close, expecting tears or a plea. Instead, he found calmness, dangerous calmness. And calmness in the face of cruelty is never a good sign. If Ethan had ever studied the way Grace watched people, the way she learned patterns, the way she stored information like a quiet archivist of human behavior, he might have realized she wasn't reacting because she had already anticipated this moment. She had already prepared for it. She had already positioned herself for what came next. But Ethan Rockwell was not a student of nuance. He was a student of noise. He proclaimed that Grace should consider this a blessing. He laughed that she could finally learn to stand without his money. He declared that he would move his mistress into the master suite by the end of the week. Every sentence he spoke tightened the trap he didn't know he was walking into. Grace watched him like someone watching a man assemble his own cage and then lock himself inside. She finally moved, not to grab the papers, but to stand. Slowly, elegantly. Ethan expected a trembling voice, maybe a desperate question. Instead, she simply walked past him, her steps steady, unhurried, serene. And that serenity struck him harder than any argument could have. It was the serenity of someone who was not losing anything today. It was the serenity of someone who already knew the truth. Because Ethan didn't know the real story. He didn't know the mansion he thought he was giving away had legally been Grace's for 6 years. He didn't know the company he believed he controlled sat quietly under her majority ownership. He didn't know her father's final act had been protecting her from exactly this moment. His ignorance was not incidental, it was catastrophic. Grace paused at the doorway, not to respond, but to let him feel the full weight of her indifference. That indifference, to a man like Ethan, was the deepest cut of all. He mistook it for defeat, for emotional collapse, for shock. He believed she was crumbling inside. But the truth was far more dangerous. She was calculating. Behind her eyes lived a truth Ethan would soon face in front of cameras, investors, and the entire world. His empire was not his. His security was borrowed. His confidence was hollow. And every boast he made in this room would soon play like irony in the story of his public humiliation. Grace walked out without looking back, leaving Ethan alone with the papers he believed were his victory. He straightened his jacket, confident that he had ended his marriage with dominance and flair. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't yet comprehend, was that slamming those divorce papers on the table wasn't the beginning of Grace's collapse. It was the trigger that would detonate his. Because the quietest person in the room is often the one holding the power he never bothered to see. Grace moved through the east wing of the mansion with the same steady rhythm she carried her entire life, a rhythm that existed long before Ethan Rockwell inserted his noise into it. She closed the dining hall doors behind her, not to shut him out emotionally, that had happened years ago, but to reclaim the quiet that belonged to her. That quiet was her inheritance, passed down from Whitmore women who built their strength in silence and wielded it in ways loud men never perceived until it was too late. Grace felt no trembling in her hands, no racing pulse, no collapsing breath. Instead, she felt something astonishing: clarity. To understand Grace, one must understand the world she came from. Harold Whitmore didn't raise a fragile daughter. He raised a strategist. From childhood, Grace absorbed the movements of high society with the patience of a scholar. She watched her mother negotiate philanthropy boards with a smile that concealed iron. She watched her father dismantle rivals at charity galas simply by asking the right question at the right moment. Power, in the Whitmore household, wasn't something that yelled. Power was something that observed. Grace remembered sitting beside her father on the veranda as a child, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. He once told her that the richest people in any room were rarely the ones speaking. The richest were the ones listening. And Grace listened to everything, always. She learned her father's mannerisms, his systems, his files, his private concerns. She saw firsthand how old money differed from Ethan's new money ambition. Old money planned for decades. New money planned for weekends. And new money often crumbled because it mistook urgency for importance. When Grace met Ethan, she thought his boldness was refreshing. He was different from the understated aristocrats she grew up around. He was loud, determined, fiercely self-made. She admired his hunger, unaware that hunger can devour a person long after they've been fed. Ethan interpreted her gentleness as awe. He believed she looked at him with admiration. In truth, she looked at him with curiosity, like someone studying a bright flame unsure if it would warm her or burn her. As their marriage unfolded, she saw warning signs. Ethan's victories were loud, his failures louder. He filled spaces with his voice, needing applause even in private. He collected attention the way others collected art, and when attention wasn't freely given, he forced it. Meetings ended with slammed doors. Dinners ended with monologues. He treated every disagreement as a battlefield and every compliment as confirmation of his superiority. Grace never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She learned to conserve energy, to let Ethan exhaust himself on performances. She observed. She documented. She remembered. And most of all, she waited. Patience was her inheritance, just as pride was Ethan's flaw. After leaving the dining hall, she entered her study, a room Ethan never bothered exploring. It lacked the extravagance he preferred. Instead, it held thick leather-bound ledgers, handwritten family journals, and carefully organized files from the Whitmore legal team. Inside a lower drawer, hidden beneath notebooks, sat an envelope her father labeled, "For Grace, when she needs the truth more than comfort." Grace pulled it out, her fingers brushing the embossed seal. She had read it before, of course, but something about today made her reopen it. Inside lay documents outlining Harold Whitmore's silent acquisition of Ethan's early ventures. He had stepped in not because he admired Ethan, but because he wanted to protect his daughter's financial stability should the marriage ever fracture. Ethan never realized how close he came to bankruptcy in those early years. He attributed every lucky break to his talent, never once questioning the invisible lifeline extended behind closed doors. And Grace let him believe it. The letter also reminded her of something Ethan still didn't understand. The Whitmore family did not lose assets. They accumulated. They protected. They planned. Grace straightened the papers, absorbing the truth once more. She wasn't just shielded from financial ruin. She held leverage. Real leverage. The kind that shifts empires. The kind that transforms humiliation into opportunity. The kind loud men never see until the quiet woman stands up. She closed the folder quietly, knowing something Ethan never considered. The moment he slammed those divorce papers on the table was not a moment of control. It was a moment of surrender. In his arrogance, he had just initiated a process he did not command. He had triggered protections he didn't know existed. He had given Grace the final confirmation she needed. Leaving her study, Grace walked past portraits of Whitmores who survived wars, scandals, and collapses far worse than an ill-mannered husband. She felt them watching her not with pity, but with expectation. Her father, especially, seemed to look down with a knowing calm, as if this was the moment he prepared her for all along. As Grace reached the staircase, her phone buzzed. A notification from her father's attorney appeared on the screen. The attorney who handled the most sensitive Whitmore affairs. His message was simple: "We should speak." Grace exhaled slowly. She knew what that meant. A threshold was approaching. Ethan believed he walked away victorious, but he had only walked blindly into the place where lions rest, mistaking their quiet for defeat. Grace stepped down the staircase, her movements deliberate. The time for silence was not over. Silence still served her. But soon, very soon, silence would become something else entirely, a weapon sharpened by truth. And Ethan was about to learn how merciless quiet power could be. Ethan Rockwell always believed his success was inevitable. He told the world he built his empire with grit and genius, that every skyscraper bearing his name existed because he forced the universe to bend to his ambition. But if anyone studied the history of his deals closely, they would have realized something else. Ethan's empire was built not on brilliance, but on noise. He mastered the art of appearing powerful long before he learned how to be powerful. And in a world obsessed with perception, noise can win battles, but it never wins wars. Long before he married Grace, Ethan learned that volume could substitute for confidence. In boardrooms, he interrupted rather than listened. In negotiations, he intimidated rather than persuaded. In interviews, he bragged rather than informed. People mistook his boldness for capability, his swagger for leadership. And Ethan, blinded by ego, believed their mistake was truth. Every success reinforced his delusion. Every failure he blamed on someone else. He loved risk, but never analysis. He loved victory, but never accountability. Deals that required patience bored him. Deals that required charm thrilled him. He chose partners who were impressed by flash rather than substance, and he avoided anyone who asked questions he couldn't answer. Ethan believed wealth was proof of wisdom, completely unaware that wealth without wisdom is a storm waiting for the right wind. But it wasn't Ethan's ego that damaged his empire most. It was his inability to recognize the people who protected him, the silent accountants who corrected his errors, the advisors who softened his missteps, and most of all, the mysterious investor who consistently backed his largest deals, ensuring they never collapsed. Ethan never questioned that investor. He assumed admiration was the reason. He assumed people believed in him because he was brilliant. He assumed wrong. While the world saw Ethan as a charismatic powerhouse, insiders whispered a different truth. His company was built on precarious foundations. He operated like a gambler who never believed he could lose. And gamblers who believe they cannot lose eventually place a bet that takes everything. Ethan's assistant once tried to warn him that several loans seemed too convenient, but Ethan shut him down with a rant about loyalty. Another time, a bank officer suggested a deeper audit, but Ethan accused them of underestimating him. Over and over, Ethan bulldozed through red flags, convinced that ignoring a problem was the same as solving it. Today, after slamming the divorce papers onto the table, he strutted through his office tower with a confidence sharpened by cruelty. He felt unstoppable. In his mind, removing Grace would simplify his life. His mistress would adore him, his friends would admire him, and his empire would finally reflect the freedom he believed he deserved. As he entered the top floor, staff members greeted him with timid smiles. They knew his mood. They knew his temper. Most of them had learned to survive by appeasement. Ethan basked in their deference, unaware that respect earned through fear evaporates the moment real power shifts. He reviewed upcoming expansions, a luxury tower in Chicago, a waterfront complex in Miami, a private equity merger. All of them depended on silent investors continuing to provide capital. Ethan believed those investors supported him because they saw potential. But the truth was stranger, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. Those investors weren't supporting him at all. They were supporting Grace. Ethan didn't know that Harold Whitmore orchestrated nearly every major deal Ethan celebrated. Harold had never trusted him, but he trusted Grace's love for him. So he invested, not to feed Ethan's ego, but to protect his daughter's financial security. Every deal Ethan bragged about, every tower he claimed credit for, every victory he flaunted, all of them existed because Harold was playing chess while Ethan played checkers. But because Harold concealed his involvement, Ethan created a narrative in which he alone was the genius behind his empire. He believed his instincts were perfect. He believed investors flocked to him because he was irreplaceable. He believed he had risen above the world that once ignored him. And now, as he prepared for another round of expansions, he made the same mistake he always made. He assumed the system supporting him would never change. He assumed Grace's silence meant insignificance. He assumed the financial world would continue stabilizing his reckless risks. But today, after that dining hall explosion, Grace was not stabilizing anything. As Ethan reviewed blueprints and congratulated himself, he felt a short-lived sting of doubt, a small, flickering intuition that something about Grace's reaction seemed off. He brushed it aside. In his worldview, quiet meant defeated. Stillness meant broken. Whatever Grace thought she was planning would amount to nothing. He believed she needed him far more than he needed her. He poured himself a drink, raising the glass to his own reflection. He saw power in that reflection. Others might have seen a man unaware of his own collapse. But Ethan only saw what he wanted to see. A winner, a conqueror, a man stronger than any challenge. He didn't know the truth was already in motion. He didn't know Grace had opened her father's envelope. He didn't know the investors he depended on answered to someone else. He didn't know the mansion he promised to his mistress wasn't legally his. And most of all, he didn't know the loudest moment of his life, slamming those papers, was already fading behind him, overshadowed by the quiet force rising in his path. Ethan believed noise built his empire. Soon, he would learn silence could dismantle it. Ethan Rockwell's affair began long before the first kiss. It began the moment admiration replaced accountability in his life. He thrived on the rush of being desired, praised, pursued. And in the glittering social sphere he operated in, there was always someone eager to impress a billionaire, someone willing to feed the ego he carried like a prized accessory. His mistress, Lila Hart, entered his world at exactly the moment he became most vulnerable to flattery. Lila was young, ambitious, and astonishingly skilled at making Ethan feel exceptional. She listened to his rants with wide eyes. She laughed at every joke with breathless adoration. She repeated his business philosophies as if they were scripture. Ethan mistook this attention for love. In truth, it was strategy. Lila understood something Ethan didn't. Men who depend on admiration are the easiest to control. Their relationship began subtly. Lingering touches, intimate conversations, late-night texts filled with validation. Ethan convinced himself he deserved her admiration, that Grace didn't appreciate him anymore, that he had evolved beyond the quiet dignity of the Whitmore family. In reality, he was addicted to Lila's performance. She gave him the illusion of superiority, an illusion he needed more than he realized. Lila, meanwhile, was drawn to the lifestyle Ethan promised. She fantasized about the mansion, the wealth, the influence. She imagined herself gliding through the hallways as the new lady of the estate, wearing jewels she never had to return, hosting parties attended by people who once dismissed her. To Lila, Ethan wasn't just a lover, he was an opportunity. And the mansion was the prize she wanted most. Whenever Ethan spoke of the mansion, Lila leaned forward, mesmerized. She asked about the ballroom, the gardens, the private wing. Ethan boasted that he would give her everything. He described rooms as if he owned them absolutely, oblivious to the legal realities Grace understood. He never investigated the paperwork because he believed ownership was defined by possession. He lived in the mansion, therefore, he believed it was his. It never occurred to him that Grace's silence on the subject wasn't indifference, it was intentional. One evening, weeks before the divorce explosion, Lila asked Ethan why the deed wasn't already in his name alone. Ethan dismissed the question with a cocky grin, insisting that technicalities meant nothing. But Lila wasn't satisfied. She wanted assurance. She wanted permanence. She wanted proof. The first crack in Ethan's fantasy appeared when she gently questioned whether he could truly deliver what he promised. Ethan responded with bravado, overcompensating for his growing unease. He promised her the master bathroom with the marble tub, the grand staircase, the two-story library he rarely entered. He promised her the landscaped gardens Grace personally oversaw. He promised her a life built on wealth he considered unquestionable. And Lila, sensing his insecurity, continued pushing, never rudely, but persistently. As their relationship intensified, so did Lila's expectations. She wanted more time, more attention, more gestures of commitment. Ethan, desperate to maintain her admiration, escalated his promises. He began discussing the mansion openly, carelessly, boldly. And as he did, he sealed his fate. Every declaration he made became another piece of evidence of his delusion. He didn't realize each promise was built on sand. Lila imagined herself replacing Grace in every sense. Ethan imagined himself liberated. In truth, both imagined a life that never existed. Lila believed she was partnering with a titan. Ethan believed he was choosing passion over obligation. But neither understood that their fantasy relied entirely on Grace's silence, and that silence was nearing its end. After Ethan slammed the divorce papers earlier that morning, he drove straight to Lila's apartment, exhilarated by what he believed was a bold step forward. He triumphantly told her the mansion was finally theirs. Lila's eyes sparkled, but there was something else behind the excitement, a demand for confirmation. She told Ethan she wanted to begin moving in soon. She asked when she could see the deed. Ethan laughed it off, assuring her he would handle it. But in that moment, something shifted in Lila. Her smile remained, but her mind began calculating. A man who couldn't produce proof might not be as powerful as he appeared. And Ethan, so used to being worshipped, didn't notice the beginning of her doubt. Lila's ambitions depended entirely on Ethan's stability. And as she watched him boast with increasing desperation, she began sensing instability instead. That sense grew when she asked again, softly, sweetly, about the deed, and he dodged the question with a fragile arrogance. After he left her apartment that afternoon, Lila stared at her reflection, realizing the truth. She wanted the mansion more than she wanted the man. Meanwhile, Ethan drove away convinced he was at the height of his power, unaware that even his mistress was beginning to question him, unaware that her doubt was the first tremor of an earthquake forming beneath his feet. He didn't know Grace already held the deed. He didn't know his promises were impossible. He didn't know Lila's faith in him was fading with every careless word. And he didn't know that the fantasy he built around his mistress was about to collapse, loudly, publicly, and irrevocably. Grace entered the solarium, a room filled with soft morning light and quiet reflections that had survived generations of Whitmore family storms. The glass panels shimmered as the sun rose higher, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe in the serenity that Ethan never appreciated. To him, this room was merely decorative, a place to parade guests through so they could remark on the imported glass and antique furnishings. To Grace, it was a sanctuary of thought, where silence revealed truths loud men refused to hear. Standing alone in the glowing space, she felt the weight of Ethan's earlier outbursts settle not as grief, but as clarity. His cruelty no longer pierced her. It merely confirmed what she had already known for years. She moved toward the small table where she kept her notebooks, journals filled with observations, dates, and small details most people would overlook. Grace had spent her marriage witnessing Ethan's mistakes, documenting his reckless decisions with the patience of someone preparing for an inevitable turning point. She never intended to weaponize her knowledge, but she also never allowed herself to forget what she saw. Ethan believed dominance was something he earned through volume. Grace understood that dominance meant nothing without respect, stability, or foresight, and Ethan possessed none of those things. As she opened her notebook, she traced the entries detailing Ethan's escalating patterns. There were pages describing the nights he returned home intoxicated by praise, believing admiration assured success. Pages outlining the investors he courted with charm, but later alienated with arrogance. Pages detailing quiet meetings with Harold's lawyers, men who taught her the exact financial structure of Ethan's empire. Grace reviewed it all not with bitterness, but with a measured calm that came from knowing she had prepared for this moment long before Ethan realized he was creating it. Her father once warned her that some men mistake kindness for weakness. Grace understood that now more than ever. Ethan had always mistaken her patience for passivity, her silence for submission. But silence was never her surrender. Silence was her study of him. Silence was the foundation of every move she planned. Silence was the strength she inherited from her mother, a woman who once stood elegantly in the face of politicians and businessmen who underestimated her until she dismantled their arguments without raising her voice. Grace had always admired that power, and today she felt it within herself. She sat down in the cushioned chair facing the gardens, remembering how Ethan once boasted to guests that he personally designed the layout. The truth was far simpler and more embarrassing for him. He never noticed the garden had been constructed according to her mother's original sketches, sketches Grace had approved long before Ethan moved into the mansion. He didn't understand the house because he didn't understand her. He lived inside the walls but never learned their history. He slept beside Grace but never learned her depths. And he ruled their marriage with the arrogance of someone who believed visibility equaled control. Grace picked up her phone and reread the attorney's message requesting a conversation. She knew what this meant. Harold's long-planned contingencies were shifting into their final stage. Ethan triggered the legal protections with his cruelty, and now the mechanisms her father created were beginning to move. Her silence would soon give way to action, not through vengeance, but through necessity. She owed it to herself, to her family, and to the legacy he entrusted to her. She stood and walked slowly toward the hallway leading into the western wing. As she moved, she passed the grand mirror Ethan insisted on installing because he enjoyed admiring himself before every party. Grace paused and looked at her reflection, seeing not the woman Ethan believed he controlled, but the woman she had always known existed beneath the surface. She saw her mother's poise, her father's strength, her grandmother's wisdom. She saw someone capable of ending a marriage without losing herself, someone who had endured humiliation without breaking, someone who understood the value of waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. Her preparation had not been accidental. Years ago, when Harold was gravely ill, he sat with Grace for hours explaining why he structured his estate in the way he did. He warned her that Ethan's ambition would eventually overshadow his affection. He predicted Ethan would betray her, not violently, but predictably. Harold designed protections not to punish Ethan, but to ensure Grace would never be financially vulnerable to his choices. Ethan would never have survived without Harold's investments, but he never recognized the source of his stability. And now he would face the consequences of his ignorance. Grace closed her notebook and returned it to the shelf with a quiet resolve settling over her. The moment Ethan slammed those divorce papers onto the table, he believed he broke her. What he broke, instead, was the illusion that she ever depended on him. He believed cruelty gave him control. But cruelty merely unveiled the truth he had been too arrogant to see. She held far more power than he imagined. As she left the solarium, Grace moved with the grace of someone stepping into a destiny she had deliberately prepared for. She no longer carried the weight of doubt or hesitation. She carried purpose. Ethan had created noise, believing it made him strong. But strength was never in the noise. Strength lived in the silence. And Grace Whitmore Rockwell was about to prove how devastating silence could be. Grace sat in the back of the town car as it rolled through the city Harold Whitmore once dominated, her thoughts weaving between past and present with an unsettling precision. She knew where she was going. Her father's attorney, the keeper of every safeguard Harold designed long before Ethan Rockwell appeared in her life. The message he sent earlier carried no urgency in its wording, but Grace understood the Whitmore code well enough. When an attorney said we should speak, it meant the ground beneath someone's feet was about to shift, and today, that someone was Ethan. The car eased to a stop outside the Whitmore legal office, a place that looked less like a firm and more like a fortress of generational power. Grace stepped inside, greeted not by rushed staff, but by an atmosphere curated for privacy. As she entered the meeting room, the attorney stood with measured calm, carrying a thick file that seemed to pulse with hidden consequence. Grace felt the weight of her father's planning in every detail, every seal, every page. She already knew what she would hear, but hearing it aloud would transform quiet knowledge into actionable truth. The attorney began by reviewing Harold's estate instructions, many of which Grace memorized years ago. But today he focused on one particular clause, one that activated the moment Ethan filed for divorce. Harold had anticipated this possibility not because he distrusted his daughter's love, but because he distrusted the charm of ambitious men who believed affection was currency. He designed financial protections that would automatically shift power to grace the moment her marriage became adversarial. And now, with Ethan's arrogance having detonated earlier that morning, the machinery was in motion. The attorney slid a signed document toward her, the silent transfer of controlling financial rights over Ethan's company, an inheritance masked as a protective measure. Grace traced her fingers across her father's signature, feeling his presence as clearly as if he were sitting across from her. This wasn't vengeance. It was preparation. And Ethan, unaware of the safety net beneath him all these years, had mistaken Harold's investment for admiration. Then the attorney revealed something Ethan would never expect. Years before his death, Harold legally transferred the deed of the mansion into Grace's name alone, sealed beneath safeguards that prevented Ethan from tampering with it. He believed he owned the mansion because he lived in it, because he decorated it, because he paraded it before guests as a symbol of his triumph. But legally, he owned nothing, not even the walls he bragged about gifting to another woman. The attorney confirmed that, as of this morning, the protections had fully activated. The mansion, the controlling shares, the silent rights behind Ethan's largest deals, all resided with Grace. Hearing the words spoken aloud struck something deep within her, not satisfaction but affirmation. Ethan had never understood the structure around him, the invisible architecture built by her father to ensure she would never be left vulnerable. Harold hadn't underestimated Ethan's ambition. He had accurately predicted his recklessness. The attorney closed the file, his eyes reflecting both sympathy and respect. Grace thanked him, though her calm was not the calm of relief. It was the calm of a storm settling into its path. She knew every move from this point would change Ethan's life in ways he could never anticipate. And yet she felt no malice, only inevitability. Ethan had mocked her silence. Soon, he would face the consequences of ignoring it. As she stepped out of the building and into the waiting sunlight, Grace understood something vital. The balance of power had shifted, not with noise, but with the quiet turn of a legal clause. Ethan believed he had initiated the end of their marriage, unaware that he had also initiated the end of his empire. And Grace, moving with steady grace toward the car, realized she no longer needed to endure his noise. The truth was ready to speak for her. The world just didn't know it yet. Grace returned to the mansion with a folder resting in her lap, its contents heavier than any weapon Ethan could imagine. The car glided through the wrought iron gates, past the fountains and stone pathways Ethan boasted about to anyone who would listen. He always described the mansion as his crowning jewel, the place that proved he belonged among the elite. He used it as a backdrop for his grandeur, a kingdom he believed he ruled. But for the first time, Grace stepped out of the car and looked at the estate not as Ethan's wife, but as its rightful owner. She walked through the grand foyer, her heels echoing across marble floors that had carried decades of Whitmore footsteps. Ethan never sensed the history beneath his own. He saw wealth, Grace saw lineage. He saw luxury, she saw legacy. And now, she felt the quiet authority of that legacy rising in her chest. She made her way to the private office Harold designed for her mother, but repurposed after her passing. Inside, the room carried the faint scent of old books and eucalyptus, the scent her mother favored when working late nights. Grace placed the folder on the desk and removed the deed. The embossed seal glimmered faintly in the afternoon light. The mansion had been hers for 6 years, legally shielded from Ethan's reach. He could brag, parade, and pretend, but pretending never changed the truth. Grace reread the clause ensuring Ethan could not sell, transfer, or legally claim ownership without her explicit approval. And then she saw the handwritten note from her father. If the day comes when someone tries to take your home, remember who built it for you. Remember who you are. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the message to settle into her bones. Then she placed the deed beside a list of upcoming investor meetings Ethan planned to attend. She recognized one name instantly, a media-backed summit meant to announce Ethan's expansion plans. It would be live-streamed to shareholders. Cameras, publicity, an audience. The perfect stage. Grace wasn't vengeful. But if the truth needed to be revealed, it should be revealed in full view of the world Ethan curated for applause. He always demanded attention. Soon, attention would dismantle him. She walked through the mansion slowly, absorbing each room with new eyes. The library Ethan never used. The gallery he claimed credit for decorating, despite Grace choosing every piece. The dining hall where he delivered his humiliating blow. She imagined him standing there again, this time understanding the power he had mocked all these years. A power far older, far quieter, far stronger than him. As she entered the master bedroom, her gaze drifted to the window overlooking the garden. She saw the place Ethan promised to his mistress. She wondered how he would react when he realized he had tried to give away something he never owned. The thought didn't bring her pleasure, only a sense of poetic inevitability. As evening settled, Grace gathered the documents and placed them into a leather portfolio. She paused at the doorway and looked back at the room not with nostalgia, but with certainty. Ethan Rockwell believed the mansion was proof of his success. Soon, he would discover it was proof of his undoing. The next morning dawned with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself were waiting for what Grace was about to unleash. She woke before sunrise, not restless but grounded, the way one feels before delivering an irrevocable truth. The portfolio of documents lay on the bedside table, silent and patient. Grace touched the leather cover as if acknowledging an ally. Today would begin quietly, but it would not end that way. She descended the staircase with calculated composure, knowing Ethan was already at his office preparing for the investor summit. He would arrive early, rehearsing the speech he believed would showcase his talent, charisma, and self-made brilliance. Grace pictured him admiring himself in the mirrored elevator, straightening his tie, unaware that the foundation beneath his confidence had already begun to crack. She brewed tea in the kitchen, savoring the warm aroma spreading through the room. Ethan never understood morning rituals. He preferred chaos, the adrenaline of rushing, the drama of being late and making others wait. Grace appreciated the opposite, the certainty that comes from beginning the day with intention. She stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the garden, and felt the energy of transition settle around her. She spent the next hour reviewing documents aloud, her voice soft but steady. She practiced explaining the truth without anger, without spectacle, without gloating. Justice didn't need theatrics. It needed clarity. And clarity was something Grace mastered long ago. By mid-morning, she dressed in a tailored suit her mother once had commissioned, a garment that conveyed quiet authority, not ostentation. Ethan always chose flashy suits for visibility. Grace chose understated ones for impact. She pinned her mother's brooch near her collar, a silent reminder of the Whitmore women who came before her, women who fought battles with elegance and strategy rather than noise. As she gathered her things, her phone buzzed. A notification showed Ethan posting a preview of the upcoming summit, boasting about extraordinary announcements. The comments filled with admiration and awe. Grace exhaled, not with frustration but with acceptance. Ethan believed the crowd was gathering to witness his triumph. He never imagined they would witness the collapse of the persona he clung to so tightly. Grace called her driver, instructing him to take her to the summit venue. The car ride was quiet, giving her space to reflect on the years Ethan spent overshadowing her with bravado, unaware that she'd built her resilience in the spaces he overlooked. She watched familiar landmarks blur by, each one holding memories of events Ethan dominated with his voice while she stood at his side, absorbing everything he missed. As the venue approached, she sensed the magnitude of the moment, not as revenge, but as revelation. The truth was coming, and Ethan had positioned himself directly beneath its weight. Grace stepped out of the car, portfolio in hand, walking toward the entrance with the steady confidence of someone who understood her lineage, her power, and her purpose. Inside, the buzz of excitement filled the air as investors, reporters, and analysts gathered. Ethan was somewhere in the building, practicing his speech, unaware that his final performance had already begun. Grace moved quietly through the hallways, her presence unnoticed yet unstoppable. The storm was coming, and this time, silence would be the thunder. Ethan stood in front of the mirrored elevator inside Rockwell Tower, adjusting his tie with the satisfaction of a man convinced he had orchestrated his own liberation. He admired the cut of his suit, the shine of his cufflinks, the way his reflection seemed to radiate triumph. This summit would be his stage, the moment he announced expansion so grand that investors would marvel at his brilliance. In his mind, he had cleared away dead weight by pushing Grace aside. He believed freedom looked like this, polished, confident, applauded. What he didn't realize was how fragile confidence becomes when it's rooted in delusion. As he stepped into the top-floor hallway, his staff scrambled to greet him. They saw the sharp edges of his mood, sensed the storm beneath his smile, and responded with quick nods and nervous eagerness. Ethan thrived on the effect he had on others. Power, to him, wasn't influence. It was intimidation dressed as charisma. He walked through the office suite as though conquering territory, oblivious to the quiet tension threading through the air. His assistant handed him the updated agenda, though his hands trembled slightly. Ethan didn't notice. He launched into a monologue about the Chicago expansion and the Miami waterfront project, describing them as inevitable successes. He imagined applause echoing across the summit's auditorium. He imagined reporters scrambling to capture his words. He imagined investors begging to participate. The louder his vision grew in his mind, the less he registered the unease around him. Behind the scenes, whispers circulated. A bank had paused their approval. An investor had postponed a meeting. A board member had requested unexpected financial documentation. But Ethan dismissed these issues as minor inconveniences, people trying to test him, nothing more. If anything, he believed the hesitation only proved how much they still needed him. He thought resistance confirmed his importance. What he didn't know was that Grace had quietly triggered her father's protections, causing the financial world to subtly shift beneath him. Ethan entered the conference room, where preparations for the summit were underway. Screens lit the walls with previews of his slides. Staff members adjusted microphones and lighting while technicians tested the live stream. The room buzzed with anticipation, the kind Ethan absorbed like oxygen. He thrived in environments where eyes watched him, where voices muttered his name, where people waited for his next declaration. He felt stronger here than anywhere else. As he reviewed his opening remarks, a small flicker of unease touched him. A memory of Grace's calm expression earlier that morning drifted into his thoughts, unsettling in its stillness. He brushed it off quickly, but it lingered. Her silence hadn't felt like defeat. It felt like preparation. The thought annoyed him. Grace was supposed to crumble, not contemplate. She was supposed to respond emotionally, not rationally. The fact that she didn't seem to challenge the narrative he built about himself. He forced the memory away and focused on Lila. She would be watching the summit online, admiring him. He pictured her nodding at his words, impressed by his confidence. He imagined her calling later to praise him for the speech and his decisive action in ending the marriage. The fantasy soothed him. Ethan clung to it, unaware that Lila had begun doubting him the moment he failed to produce proof of the mansion deed. The head of PR approached him with updates about investor attendance. Ethan didn't notice her hesitancy as she spoke. He didn't hear the subtle warning embedded in her tone. He didn't perceive the shift in the room's atmosphere as people avoided meeting his eyes. He was too wrapped in the story he told himself, the story where he was the hero reshaping his destiny. Yet even as he practiced his speech again, a strange tension followed him, a quiet dissonance that made the room feel colder. Something felt out of place, though Ethan couldn't identify what. He blamed nerves, though he never admitted nerves existed. He blamed his staff, though they hadn't done anything wrong. He blamed the pressure of the summit, though he believed pressure elevated him. What he never considered was the truth. Grace had already begun dismantling the fantasy he lived inside. He walked toward the stage area, shoulders squared, confidence swelling again. He didn't know that the words he planned to speak today would soon be overshadowed by words Grace would speak tomorrow. He didn't know the applause he anticipated would transform into shock. He didn't know the spotlight he craved would illuminate his downfall. Ethan believed he was rising toward his greatest triumph. In reality, he was rising toward the greatest fall of his life. Across the city, Lila Hart sat in her luxurious apartment, luxury paid for entirely by Ethan, staring at the messages he sent her that morning. He typed with unusual excitement, bragging about the summit, the expansions, the freedom he believed he finally gained. But as Lila read his words, her excitement didn't match his. A lingering worry pulsed beneath her admiration, a small but growing fear that Ethan wasn't as stable as she once believed. She remembered the moment she asked him for proof of the mansion deed. His reaction, deflection mixed with arrogance, had unsettled her. Lila was ambitious, yes, but she wasn't naive. She knew that wealthy men often exaggerated their control over property. She also knew that marrying into wealth required certainty, not promises. And certainty was the one thing Ethan had failed to provide. Lila paced in front of the large windows overlooking the skyline, her mind racing through every interaction she had with Ethan in the past month. His ego made him dazzling, but also dangerous. His confidence made him magnetic, but also unstable. She replayed his promises, noticing how each one grew louder, bolder, more theatrical. And theatrics, she knew, often concealed insecurity. She sat on the edge of her couch, thinking of her own story. Lila had grown up in a world where opportunities rarely presented themselves. She fought for every advantage she earned. Ethan had offered her a shortcut, a fast track into the life she dreamed of. But dreams built on shaky ground can collapse without warning, and the ground beneath Ethan seemed to shake more every day. She opened her laptop and searched public property records, fully expecting to see Ethan listed as the mansion's owner. Instead, she found nothing. No listing, no documentation, no trace of him connected to the estate. A ripple of panic moved through her. She refreshed the search, thinking she made a mistake. Still nothing. She changed filters, searched alternate spellings, even expanded the search to surrounding estates. Nothing. Not a single record connected the mansion to Ethan Rockwell. Lila felt the air leave her lungs. She realized the truth before she was ready to accept it. Ethan had been making promises he wasn't sure he could fulfill. And if he couldn't fulfill those promises, then what else was he lying about? What else was he exaggerating? What foundations of his life were real? She closed the laptop, her hands trembling slightly. Ethan's summit speech would begin in hours, a performance he believed would affirm his dominance. But Lila didn't feel the same certainty she once did. She felt unease, like a storm gathering behind a charming smile. She wondered why Grace's name appeared in some of the older property filings. She wondered why Ethan had never mentioned any of this. Her phone buzzed. Ethan again. Another message full of excitement and bravado. Lila stared at it, unsure how to respond. She had once admired his confidence. Now it felt reckless, desperate. Hello. She typed a quick message asking again about the mansion. Ethan replied instantly, telling her not to worry. But his quickness only heightened her concern. He was trying too hard. He was covering something. She sensed it now with full clarity. Lila stood and walked to the mirror, studying her reflection. She imagined the life she wanted, the life Ethan promised. But she also imagined the consequences of tying her future to a man who might not have the power he claimed. She wondered who Grace truly was beneath the quiet exterior. She wondered why Grace had not fought back or reacted with rage. She wondered if Grace knew something Ethan didn't. A realization struck her like a sudden spark. Grace's silence wasn't fear. It was knowledge. Lila felt the ground shift beneath her dreams as the truth crystallized. Ethan wasn't the titan she imagined. He was a man pretending to be a king inside a castle he didn't own. And she began to fear that when the truth emerged, she would be standing too close to the ruins. Grace arrived at the Whitmore Trust Bank with the same quiet determination her father carried during his most pivotal negotiations. The building's stone facade rose into the sky with an imposing elegance that mirrored the family's legacy. Inside, the air held the faint scent of polished wood and ink, an atmosphere built for power, not performance. Grace stepped through the lobby, her posture steady, her expression composed. She understood the significance of today. Every decision she made would change the trajectory of Ethan's future. The bank manager, a longtime Whitmore associate, greeted her with a respect Ethan never earned. She followed him into a private office overlooking the city, a view that once intimidated her but now felt like a map of possibilities. As the manager opened a secure drawer and retrieved a series of documents, Grace felt the shift in momentum, not loud, but absolute. Harold's preparations were unfolding, piece by piece. The manager reviewed Ethan's accounts, loans, and investment ties, confirming what Harold anticipated years ago. Ethan's empire relied heavily on silent backing Grace now controlled. A single signature today could freeze or redirect funds Ethan believed were untouchable. Grace listened carefully, absorbing each detail, weighing responsibility against justice. She didn't seek revenge. She sought alignment, aligning truth with consequence, aligning Ethan's arrogance with the reality he ignored. When the manager asked whether she wished to activate the financial protections, Grace hesitated only long enough to breathe. Ethan had initiated the end of their marriage with cruelty, believing he would walk away powerful and unchallenged. But he had never understood the cost of humiliating someone who held the keys to his stability. Grace nodded, granting authorization. The manager executed the action with solemn efficiency. One by one, Ethan's accounts shifted under new restrictions. Lines of credit paused. Automatic approvals halted. Silent investors received notifications that Grace now governed the financial direction of the Rockwell projects. Even though Ethan wouldn't notice immediately, the domino effect had begun. His empire, built on borrowed confidence and invisible safeguards, was losing its foundation. Grace didn't feel triumphant, only resolute. She thought of the years she endured Ethan's loud ambitions, his disregard for consequences, his inability to recognize the difference between dominance and partnership. She thought of the morning he slammed those divorce papers onto the table, believing he controlled the narrative. And now, as the bank executed the final authorization, Grace understood the depth of her father's wisdom. Harold had seen Ethan's arrogance long before she did, and he armed her with tools Ethan never knew existed. The bank manager gave her a cautious look, as though sensing the gravity of what would follow. He warned her that Ethan would not react well once he discovered his accounts were frozen. Grace met the warning with calm certainty. She wasn't afraid of Ethan's anger. She had lived in its shadow long enough. What she feared once was his ability to strip her security. But that fear no longer existed. She had stepped into her inheritance. Not money, not property, but power shaped by foresight. As she left the office, Grace felt the subtle shift within herself. She was no longer simply responding to Ethan's betrayal. She was stepping into the role her father always knew she could hold. She was moving from silence into strategy, from patience into precision. Outside, the sun warmed her face as she walked back to the car. She imagined Ethan standing in his office, unaware that the first cracks in his foundation had formed. He believed he controlled the pace of their separation. He believed he held all the cards. He believed she was the one losing everything. But today proved something else entirely. Ethan's empire had never been his. And by the time he realized it, Grace would already be 10 steps ahead. Ethan stormed into his office after a tense phone call with one of his project managers, convinced the world was testing him on the day he needed everything to run smoothly. His irritation was volcanic, rising faster than reason. He demanded updates, numbers, confirmations, anything that would reaffirm the control he believed he still possessed. But the responses he received were cautious, fragmented, uneasy. Approvals that should have been automatic were suddenly pending. Transactions that should have cleared instantly were under review. Ethan dismissed each issue as incompetence. It never occurred to him that the system had shifted without his consent. He leaned over his desk, scrolling through expenditures, fees, and pending transfers. His eyes narrowed as he noticed a delayed release of funds for one of his major expansion projects. It wasn't a massive delay, yet, but it was enough to irritate him. He called the financial liaison, demanding answers. The liaison hesitated, stumbling through vague explanations that made Ethan's temper rise. The truth hovered just beneath the surface, but Ethan refused to see it. Grace had already activated the financial protections. Her quiet signature at the bank had begun unraveling the empire he believed indestructible. Elon Rockwell, self-proclaimed visionary, was now learning how fragile his foundation truly was. He paced the room, muttering frustrations to himself. He told his assistant to contact the bank immediately. When he finally reached a representative, the response only heightened his agitation. The bank cited routine verification, a phrase that irritated him like sandpaper. He insisted on speaking to someone higher. He demanded clarity. But every answer he received sounded like a carefully prepared script, wrapped in formality to avoid giving him the truth. He slammed the phone onto the desk, breathing heavily. Something about this wasn't right. He sensed a shift, a wrongness he couldn't articulate. He blamed the timing, the staff, even the bank's procedures. But deep inside, the unease grew stronger. This wasn't random. It was coordinated. Someone had disrupted his financial flow. But Ethan, so accustomed to assuming he commanded the world, never considered that the disruption came from the person he underestimated most. He stared out the window at the sprawling city skyline, trying to regain the confidence he usually found there. But today, the buildings felt distant, uncooperative. The power he loved to absorb from the view didn't reach him. He replayed the morning with Grace, her silence, her unbroken calm. Something about her expression gnawed at him. She looked too composed, too prepared, too certain. Ethan shook the thought away, unwilling to accept that Grace might still hold power in a story he believed he'd rewritten. His assistant entered the office quietly, carrying new reports. Ethan snatched them and scanned the pages, feeling pressure mount as numbers and delays aligned into a pattern he refused to acknowledge. Investors were cautious. Approvals were stalling. Meetings were rescheduled without explanation. It felt as though invisible hands were tightening around his operations. The assistant cautiously mentioned that some investors requested confirmation from Grace's side of the estate, not Ethan's. That single sentence froze the air. Ethan's jaw tightened. Why would investors want to speak with Grace? Why would they bypass him on the day he was unveiling his biggest expansion yet? He dismissed the assistant with a wave, but inside his certainty cracked. Doubt seeped into the cracks. Not yet fear. Ethan wasn't capable of naming fear, but something adjacent to it, something he recognized but refused to label. He picked up his phone and called Lila, wanting reassurance from the one person who still adored him. But even in her voice, something felt different, a subtle hesitation, a tremor of doubt. She asked once again whether he secured the mansion deed. Ethan snapped at the question, anger covering insecurity. When he ended the call, he didn't feel reassured. He felt exposed. Ethan looked around his office, once a symbol of dominance, now dimmed by uncertainty. He tightened his tie, straightened his suit, and forced himself to breathe. He needed to maintain composure. Not for truth. He wasn't seeking truth, but to preserve the illusion he depended on. He didn't know the illusion had already begun to crumble, and the cracks were widening faster than he realized. By late afternoon, Ethan's patience had dissolved into pure agitation. He couldn't tolerate another vague answer or delayed approval. Feeling cornered, he left his office abruptly, ignoring the startled expressions of his staff. He needed to regain control, now. And in his mind, control meant confronting Grace, the person he believed was responsible for his unraveling mood. He drove home with the force of a man unwilling to accept vulnerability. His thoughts twisted, reshaping Grace into the source of his frustration. He convinced himself she must be plotting something. He told himself she intentionally refused to react to his cruelty. He believed he still held the upper hand, and that confronting her would restore order. Arrogance painted every thought he had. When he burst through the mansion doors, he found Grace in the foyer, calm as ever, collecting her belongings with graceful intention. Ethan expected shock, guilt, self-defense, anything confirming his superiority. Instead, she lifted her gaze with the same steady composure she carried that morning. Her calm infuriated him. He launched into accusations, insisting she was sabotaging him, claiming she was manipulating finances, demanding explanations. Grace didn't flinch. She let him rant, watching him with a gaze that seemed almost sympathetic. Yet it wasn't sympathy, it was understanding. She understood him now more clearly than he understood himself. When Ethan demanded she respond, Grace spoke only briefly, explaining she hadn't done anything outside her rights and that he should review the documents he signed years ago. Her tone was not defensive, it was informative. Ethan froze, startled by the quiet implication. The documents he signed? He brushed the thought away, refusing to acknowledge a possibility that frightened him. Grace stepped past him, her silence a reminder that she no longer played the role he assigned her. She moved with elegance, not urgency, and the subtle power in her steps rattled Ethan more than any argument could have. She was no longer the quiet wife he dominated. She was a woman carrying the confidence of truth. Ethan watched her ascend the staircase, something sinking inside him, a truth he refused to articulate. She wasn't afraid of him. He shouted after her to demand obedience, to reclaim authority, but she didn't turn around. The sound of her steps echoed up the stairs, steady and unfaltering. That rhythm haunted him. He hadn't realized it before, but Grace's steps were always steady. He ignored them because they didn't match his chaos. But now, hearing them as she walked away, he sensed something terrifying. Those weren't the steps of someone leaving. Those were the steps of someone rising. Ethan stood alone in the foyer, the weight of her stillness pressing on him like a revelation he wasn't prepared for. The mansion suddenly felt foreign, hostile even. The walls he believed obeyed him seemed to shift subtly toward Grace's side. He felt the balance change, though he did not understand how. He returned to the dining hall, the place where he believed he claimed victory that morning. But as he looked at the table, he no longer saw dominance. He saw the moment he triggered everything that followed. He saw the arrogance of his assumptions. He saw the silence that answered him, a silence louder than any retaliation. Still, Ethan forced himself to believe he remained in control. He refused to accept another narrative. But a tiny, unwelcome thought pierced through the noise. What if Grace wasn't the one losing? What if he was? That night, unable to quiet the unease gnawing at him, Ethan retreated to his private office and searched for the contracts Grace referenced earlier. He dug through old files, tossing papers aside in frustration. He knew he signed mountains of documents during the early years of his company, but he never read them closely. Reading was for cautious men. Ethan was a man of instinct, or so he believed. Hours passed before he found the folder. It was unassuming, labeled simply with the year Harold Whitmore intervened in Ethan's failing ventures. Ethan remembered that year vividly. He remembered the stress, the desperation, the feeling that his empire was slipping before it even formed. He also remembered how miraculously everything turned around after Grace introduced him to her father's legal team. He never asked questions about those documents. He never wondered why approvals suddenly flowed or why investors who once ignored him suddenly offered millions. He assumed he had manifested their faith. Now he stared at the papers, feeling a tightening in his chest. As he flipped through the pages, the truth revealed itself line by line. Harold Whitmore had structured the investment as a silent, controlling interest, one that transferred entirely to Grace upon his death. Ethan's signature, bold and oblivious, appeared at the bottom of each page. His hands trembled slightly, a sensation unfamiliar and unwelcome. The clauses were clear. Grace inherited silent authority over the company. She possessed the legal right to override decisions, restrict funds, and remove leadership when necessary. Ethan scanned the text again, disbelief eroding the edges of his ego. He had signed away the very power he bragged about. He dropped the contract on the desk, staring at it as though it were a weapon aimed directly at him. His mind raced, trying to rewrite the narrative, trying to convince himself there was a loophole, an error, a misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had chained himself long before Grace ever exerted her influence. He never read the fine print. Harold had predicted his arrogance perfectly. Ethan felt sweat gather at his temples. He imagined Grace at the bank earlier, calmly exercising a power he didn't know she possessed. He imagined investors shifting allegiance. He imagined his empire, his pride, his identity, balancing on a signature he scribbled years ago without care. His phone buzzed on the desk. He ignored it. Another buzz. Another. Finally, he glanced at the screen. Multiple missed messages from his chief financial officer. Multiple warnings. Multiple alerts. He opened one. Funding hold confirmed. Pending review by controlling authority. Controlling authority. Grace. His breath caught as the walls around him seemed to close in. The silence of the mansion felt sinister now, as though it held secrets waiting to consume him. He grabbed the contract again, scanning for any sign he misunderstood. But the truth remained. Grace Whitmore Rockwell wasn't just his wife. She was the architect of his survival. And now, she was the architect of his collapse. He lowered the contract slowly, realizing the most devastating truth of all. Grace hadn't needed to fight him. He had defeated himself long ago. Ethan barely slept. The contract he rediscovered haunted him through the night, every clause replaying in his mind like a taunt. By morning, he convinced himself there had to be a mistake. Harold Whitmore couldn't have stripped him of power. Grace couldn't have inherited that much authority. And even if she had, there had to be a legal way to undo it. Ethan clung to that belief as he rushed to his attorney's office, dragging the contract in the same crumpled state he left it in. His attorney's firm was sleek, modern, and accustomed to wealthy clients demanding immediate attention. Ethan walked in with that expectation, not noticing the subtle discomfort in the receptionist's expression as she called the partners. He didn't see the cautious glances exchanged behind glass walls. Whispers had already begun spreading, not rumors, but quiet confirmations. Grace Whitmore was exercising legal rights none of them knew she possessed. When Ethan's attorney finally greeted him, the man looked unusually restrained. He led Ethan to a conference room, closed the door, and braced himself. Ethan launched into a frantic explanation, waving the contract as if it were evidence of betrayal. He demanded they challenge it, overturn it, break it, nullify it, anything to restore the authority he believed was still rightfully his. The attorney studied the contract slowly, methodically, line by line. Ethan paced behind him, unable to tolerate a single second of silence. But silence was unavoidable. It was the sound of reality settling in. When the attorney finally spoke, his voice held the careful cadence of someone delivering bad news to a volatile client. The contract, he explained, was airtight. Harold Whitmore's legal team was legendary for a reason. Every clause was ironclad, every signature binding. Every protection Grace now held had been constructed with foresight and flawless precision. The attorney admitted he couldn't challenge it. No lawyer could. Ethan's disbelief exploded into anger. He accused them of incompetence, demanded they fight harder, even implying they were afraid of Grace. But the attorney maintained composure, reminding him that fighting a losing battle would only worsen the outcome. He added, carefully, that the Whitmore legal branch was known for dismantling opponents effortlessly. Challenging their contracts was not a demonstration of bravery. It was a demonstration of foolishness. Ethan felt the room constrict around him. He could feel the humiliation rising, choking him. He hated this feeling, this sense of losing control. He pounded the table, demanding alternatives. The attorney spread his hands helplessly. There were none. Grace's authority was absolute, activated legally and irrevocably. The final blow came when Ethan insisted they represent him in a forthcoming board challenge. The attorney paused, choosing his words carefully. Their firm, he explained, could no longer represent him. There was a conflict of interest. Too many of their clients had connections to the Whitmore estate, and they would not risk jeopardizing long-standing relationships. In other words, Ethan was alone. The realization struck like a crack of thunder. His support system wasn't eroding, it had evaporated. He stormed out of the room, slamming the conference door open so hard it rattled the hallway. Attorneys and staff looked up, watching him with wide, uneasy eyes. He thought they feared his anger. In truth, they feared being associated with him. Outside, Ethan stood on the sidewalk, gasping for cold air as the noise of the city filled his ears. He felt exposed in a way he hadn't felt in years. His empire had survived because others believed he was stable. Now, that belief was crumbling, and with it, his identity. He climbed into his car, hands shaking, and ordered the driver to return to his office. He needed to regroup, reassert control, rebuild the story. But beneath the bravado, beneath the denial, beneath the rage, a truth whispered in the part of his mind he couldn't silence. Grace wasn't just dismantling his empire. She was revealing how little of it he ever truly owned. While Ethan unraveled across the city, Grace sat in her private lounge reviewing the documents once more. She had spent the morning speaking with her father's attorney and confirming the final steps required to execute the transfer of power. Every clause activated, every condition met, every safeguard Harold built now rested in her hands. She felt the weight of responsibility, not fear, settling into her chest. Today wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration, restoring truth, restoring structure, restoring her life. She organized the portfolio for tomorrow's board meeting, sliding each document into its precise place. The room was quiet, filled only with the subtle rustling of paper and the gentle ticking of the antique clock her mother once adored. Grace moved with deliberate calm, absorbing the quiet strength her upbringing instilled. Years of silence had taught her the value of precision. Today, every detail mattered. Her phone vibrated with a message from a board member confirming attendance. Another message followed from an investor expressing support for her leadership transition. These weren't congratulatory notes. They were acknowledgments of the inevitable. The financial world understood something Ethan didn't. Stability mattered more than ego, and Grace was stability embodied. She stepped out into the hallway, walking toward her father's old study. The room remained untouched, a preserved monument to the man who prepared her for battles she never wanted but now needed to face. She stood before his framed portrait, taking in the familiar sternness softened only by the kindness in his eyes. She whispered a quiet thought, not a plea, but gratitude. Harold had trusted her with power many would envy, but she didn't see it as a crown. She saw it as a shield she now needed to wield. As she reviewed tomorrow's strategy, she reminded herself of the truth. She didn't destroy Ethan's empire. Ethan destroyed it through arrogance, recklessness, and the belief that silence equaled weakness. Grace simply removed the illusion that had protected him from the consequences of his own behavior. The house was quiet, but not empty. It hummed with momentum. The same walls that witnessed Ethan's insults now watched Grace rise. She walked toward the solarium, pausing to take in the garden. Tomorrow, the world would finally see what she had known all along. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't passive. She wasn't the woman Ethan thought she was. She was a Whitmore. And tomorrow, she would walk into that boardroom not as Ethan's wife, but as the true authority behind the empire. Lila Hart sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection with a mixture of apprehension and growing disillusionment. She applied her makeup slowly, her movements less certain than usual. Ethan had sent her a series of frantic messages throughout the day, his tone shifting from excitement to irritation to forced confidence. At first, Lila believed he simply needed reassurance. Now she sensed something deeper, desperation. She opened her laptop again, revisiting the property searches she performed earlier. No matter how many times she checked, the truth remained unchanged. Ethan had no legal claim to the mansion. The reality unsettled her deeply. She entered this relationship imagining stability, advancement, prestige. But stability requires truth, and truth seemed increasingly distant from Ethan's version of events. As she rewatched clips of Ethan's previous interviews, the cracks in his persona became clearer. His answers rambled. His confidence looked performative. His gestures exaggerated dominance rather than expressing vision. She had once found his arrogance intoxicating. Now it felt artificial, hollow, maybe even dangerous. She thought about Grace, quiet, elegant, unfazed by Ethan's outbursts. Lila replayed the moment Ethan described Grace's reaction to the divorce. He had expected shock. He expected tears. But the woman did nothing. That silence unsettled Lila more than Ethan realized. What kind of woman remains calm when her husband announces betrayal? A woman with nothing to lose? Or a woman with more power than he understood? The more Lila considered it, the more she sensed Ethan was hiding behind bravado. She wondered if Grace knew something that Ethan didn't. And if Grace knew it, did Lila want to be on the wrong side when it revealed itself? She stared at her phone, reading the message she received earlier from Ethan. Everything is going according to plan. But the message didn't match the frantic energy she felt from him. She sensed the instability beneath the surface, and it scared her. Lila wasn't loyal enough to risk collapse. She was here for opportunity, and opportunities don't survive chaos. She exhaled sharply and stood, pacing the room. She had never truly loved Ethan. She loved the lifestyle he represented. If that lifestyle disappeared, so did her reason to stay. She needed to protect herself. She needed to distance herself before the fallout. She drafted a message, polite yet pointed, asking Ethan once more about the deed. His response came quickly, a brief reassurance, almost pleading. Lila frowned. This wasn't the Ethan she admired. This was a man losing control. She deleted his messages, one by one, as though erasing her connection to his unraveling empire. She began packing a small bag, nothing dramatic, just enough to signify she wouldn't be waiting for him tonight. She zipped the suitcase, feeling the first sense of clarity she had experienced in days. Lila wasn't leaving completely. Not yet. But she was stepping back, far enough to avoid the blast she increasingly sensed was coming. As she walked toward the door, she whispered to herself, acknowledging a truth she didn't want to admit. Grace wasn't the weak one in this story. Ethan was. Ethan tore through his office like a man fighting shadows, rifling through drawers and cabinets in a frantic search for the mansion deed. Papers flew across the floor like defeated soldiers. His breathing grew ragged as he ripped open folders and overturned stacks of files. He had convinced himself the deed had to be here, that the missing document was just another frustrating misplacement. Because the alternative, the possibility that Grace owned the mansion outright, was unthinkable. If Grace truly held the deed, everything he had promised Lila, everything he had bragged about to investors, everything he believed supported his dominance, was a lie he told himself long before he told it to anyone else. He reached for another folder, hands shaking with a mix of anger and dread, when a small envelope slid out from the back. It was sealed, its edges crisp, its label written in Harold Whitmore's unmistakable handwriting. Ethan froze. The seal tightened his chest as he recognized the script he once admired in philanthropic letters and business contracts. With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope. Inside, he found the original deed, and Grace's name was printed boldly at the top. Not his. Never his. Ethan's breath left him in a shudder. The realization clawed at his mind. Harold had given the mansion to Grace long before Ethan began using it as a trophy. He never questioned the ownership because he never bothered to read the papers. He assumed that living in luxury meant owning it. But possession is not ownership, and arrogance is not power. The deed was accompanied by a brief note, written by Harold before his death. The message was simple, devastating, and precise. For Grace. To protect her future. Ethan read it twice, then again, each repetition tightening the noose around his pride. Harold had never trusted him. Harold hadn't invested in him. Harold invested in Grace's security. The truth hit Ethan like a collapse of steel and glass. All his plans, promising the mansion to Lila, picturing her in Grace's place, imagining a new kingdom built on his terms, crumbled in an instant. He felt heat rising behind his eyes, not grief but humiliation. Humiliation so sharp it bordered on panic. He stumbled backward, landing against the wall as the room spun. For the first time in years, Ethan saw himself clearly, not as a self-made billionaire, not as a visionary, not as a man admired for his power, but as someone who lived inside a world constructed by another man. A world he never controlled. A world built on quiet structures, strategic signatures, and meticulous foresight. He scrambled to his feet, pacing the room with the agitated energy of a trapped animal. If Grace held the deed, then what else did she hold? How much of his empire belonged to her already? What decisions had he blustered through while she quietly kept the pieces from collapsing? He slammed his fist onto the desk, the sound ricocheting through the office. Rage surged through him, but it was no longer the rage of dominance. It was the rage of fear. Fear of losing everything. Fear of being exposed. Fear of being insignificant. He grabbed his phone to call Lila, his voice desperate for validation. But she didn't answer. He tried again. Still nothing. The silence on the other end punctured him in a way Grace's silence never did. Lila was slipping through his fingers, just like the empire he once believed indestructible. He looked down at the deed again, the paper crumpling where his fingers gripped too tightly. Grace would never need to raise her voice. This document alone would dismantle the illusion he built his identity around. He shoved the deed back into the envelope, though the seal had been broken. His hand still shook as he stuffed it into his inner jacket pocket. The envelope felt heavier than any burden he had carried before, because it was the truth, and truth weighs more than lies. Tonight, Ethan realized the painful reality. He wasn't the king of this mansion. He was the guest, and he had overstayed his welcome. Grace's morning began with an unusual stillness, the kind that precedes a decisive moment. She sat at her father's antique desk reviewing the final set of documents she would present at the board meeting later that day. Each page was a testament to Harold's insight, a reflection of his belief that power should flow to the responsible, not the loud. Grace touched the embossed seals with the reverence of someone honoring both legacy and duty. She organized the files into the leather portfolio, ensuring nothing was out of order. Tomorrow the world would understand the truth. For now, the stage was being set quietly. She had no need for revenge. Her goal wasn't to destroy Ethan. It was to realign what he had carelessly fractured. And the first step to restoring stability was removing him from the helm of the company he didn't know how to steer. A soft knock sounded at the door. One of the Whitmore advisors entered, updating her on investor reactions. Many expressed relief at her stepping forward. Some had even requested meetings with her instead of Ethan. Confidence was shifting in her direction, quietly but unmistakably. Power moves silently until the moment it doesn't. Grace thanked the advisor and returned her focus to the documents. She practiced her remarks in her mind, succinct, clear, precise. She would not humiliate Ethan openly. She wouldn't need to. Truth alone would dismantle him, and the board would witness the truth directly from the source. Later, she walked through the mansion, absorbing the certainty of her decision. Every hallway carried echoes of Harold's discipline, her mother's grace, generations of Whitmore resilience. She felt strengthened by them as she prepared to take the position she had quietly earned. The sun shifted, casting beams of gold across the floor as she entered the solarium. She paused, reflecting on the years she spent enduring Ethan's noise. His loudness once felt like a force of nature she had to navigate, but now she saw it for what it was: insecurity disguised as dominance. Real dominance does not need to be expressed. It reveals itself. She returned to her room and changed into a tailored charcoal ensemble, a symbol not of wealth but authority. She attached Harold's pin near her collar, an anchor to the strength he foresaw in her. As she adjusted it, she caught her reflection in the mirror. She saw alignment. She saw readiness. Just before leaving, her phone buzzed with a confirmation. The boardroom would be fully staffed, and the live stream preparations were complete. Grace exhaled slowly, understanding that everything was now in motion. Ethan believed the world would gather today to witness his triumph. Instead, they would witness the transfer of power he never saw coming. As she walked to the front door, she felt no hesitation, only purpose. Grace wasn't just locking in her victory. She was opening the door to her rightful future. Ethan arrived at the summit venue dressed in arrogance and desperation, though he hid the latter beneath polished charm. He forced himself to greet investors with the same magnetic confidence he had always used. But something in the room felt different today. Conversations quieted when he approached. Eyes shifted away rather than toward him, and the tension in the air felt like a warning he couldn't decipher. Still, Ethan pushed forward, determined to dominate the stage. He rehearsed lines in his head, imagining applause, envisioning headlines praising his ambition. He convinced himself the earlier chaos with the deed, with the bank, with the attorneys, none of it mattered if he controlled the narrative today. But as he walked toward the boardroom, he sensed a strange hum beneath the usual buzz of anticipation. The room wasn't filled with eager expectation. It was filled with restrained energy. Investors gathered in clusters, whispering with urgency. Analysts typed quickly, their eyes flicking toward their screens. Camera crews adjusted equipment with unusual haste. Even the lighting felt sharper than usual, as if the moment demanded extra clarity. Ethan straightened his jacket, ignoring the tightness in his chest. He pushed open the boardroom doors with the swagger he always used, shoulders broad, chin lifted, presence demanding the attention of everyone inside. But he did not command the attention. Grace did. She stood at the head of the table, her presence calm, composed, and undeniably authoritative. She wore the charcoal ensemble with Harold's pin gleaming softly near her collar. She didn't look at Ethan immediately. She looked at the board members, at the investors, at the cameras. And when she finally lifted her gaze to him, her eyes carried the quiet certainty of someone who held every truth he feared. Ethan's stride faltered for the briefest second. He recovered quickly, forcing a dismissive smirk, but the damage was done. The board had seen it. The cameras caught it. Something fundamental had shifted. Grace greeted the room with a steady voice, explaining that she had requested this meeting to clarify critical information regarding the company's ownership and financial direction. Ethan tried to interrupt, but she continued without raising her voice. Her composure made his attempts to speak look childish, erratic. Documents appeared on the table before each board member, precise, organized, bearing Harold Whitmore's seals. Every page revealed truths Ethan had ignored. The controlling interest, the silent authority, the inherited power, the deed. Ethan's pulse hammered. The room seemed to close around him. His identity, built on noise, shook under the weight of Grace's stillness. As Grace revealed the first piece of the truth, the boardroom didn't erupt. It woke, and Ethan realized far too late that this was not his stage. It was hers. The moment Grace began speaking, the atmosphere in the boardroom shifted from anticipation to stunned attention. Her voice carried a calm authority that silenced even the faint hum of whispered conversations. She stood with the poise of someone who had spent years watching, learning, and preparing, not for revenge, but for truth. Every board member leaned slightly forward as she outlined the structure of the company's ownership, each revelation meticulously supported by documentation bearing Harold Whitmore's unmistakable seal. Ethan remained frozen near the end of the table, his confidence evaporating with every sentence she delivered. He attempted to interrupt, to challenge her, to reclaim the narrative, but his words faltered under the weight of the evidence presented. Grace did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her composure contrasted sharply with his unraveling agitation, and the juxtaposition exposed the fragility of the power he once believed unshakable. She explained how Harold's investment had saved the company from collapse in its infancy, how Ethan's early failures had been hidden behind carefully constructed financial scaffolding, and how every major decision Ethan celebrated was quietly stabilized by Whitmore oversight. The truth, spoken plainly, dismantled the mythology Ethan had built around himself. He had always believed he rose through brilliance. Now it was clear he had risen through protection. Ethan felt heat rush through his face as the board examined the documents. The pages did not lie. His signature appeared everywhere, proof that he had willingly handed over authority in exchange for the stability he once took for granted. His breath grew uneven, but he tried to maintain a posture of confidence. Yet the facade grew thinner with every passing moment. Grace then presented the inheritance papers confirming her control of Harold's shares. Her authority was not new. It had been in place since her father's passing. She had simply chosen not to exercise it, until Ethan forced her hand. Board members exchanged glances, some shocked, some unsurprised, but all understanding the magnitude of what was unfolding. Ethan didn't just lose leverage today. He lost the illusion that he ever possessed it. At last, Grace addressed the most devastating truth. Ethan had violated multiple fiduciary guidelines with his reckless expansions, endangering the company's future. She stated it without spite, without anger, but with the precision of someone fulfilling a duty. Her calm delivery made the accusation even more piercing. The room inhaled sharply as she concluded that for the stability of the company, immediate leadership restructuring was necessary. Ethan surged forward, desperate to salvage the remains of his image. He tried to dismiss her claims, insisting she misunderstood business strategy. But his voice cracked, betraying panic. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that Grace was the only steady presence in the room. A board member raised a hand, asking Grace to elaborate on Ethan's restricted financial accounts. Ethan's heart raced as he realized how much she knew, how much she had always known. Grace answered concisely, confirming that his accounts were frozen for further review, triggering murmurs of alarm among the board. The final blow came when Grace revealed the deed to the mansion. She placed it gently on the table, and its gold seal reflected the overhead lights like a verdict handed down from above. Ethan stared at it, numb. Seeing his collapse on paper, in front of cameras and colleagues, stripped him of any remaining illusion. The room stilled, heavy with realization. Ethan's empire wasn't crumbling. It had crumbled. Grace wasn't rising. She had always been above him. The only difference was that now everyone could see it. As the board prepared for the vote, Ethan felt his knees weaken. This wasn't a battle. It was a reckoning. And he finally understood. Grace hadn't just taken power. She had revealed she never needed to. The vote was swift, decisive, and devastating. Ethan had always imagined that if the board ever questioned his leadership, he could rally them with charm, intimidation, or sheer force of will. But today none of that mattered. His reputation, once inflated by noise, now deflated beneath the weight of documented truth. The investors who once admired his boldness now saw recklessness. The board members who once tolerated his temper now saw liability. As each hand rose in agreement with Grace's motion to remove him as CEO, Ethan felt something inside him fracture. It wasn't just pride, it was identity. He had built his entire sense of self around the belief that he controlled the empire he had assembled. But this vote revealed a far harsher reality. Without Harold's intervention, without Grace's silent stewardship, without the financial structures he never understood, Ethan Rockwell was a man propped up by luck and ignorance. And luck had finally run out. Grace remained composed, watching the proceedings with a quiet dignity that only intensified Ethan's humiliation. She didn't revel in the moment. She didn't smirk or taunt. She simply accepted the board's decision with the grace her name promised, confirming the transition with professionally worded statements. Her restraint made his collapse more absolute. Ethan's mind raced, searching for something, anything, to say that would salvage the moment. But every word he conjured felt hollow, inconsistent with the facts laid bare before him. When he attempted to defend himself, the board listened with the polite detachment one offers a defeated adversary. His voice cracked as he spoke. He blamed external factors, misunderstood intentions, even Grace's silence. Yet nothing he said could outweigh the truth. When the official vote was recorded, Ethan felt the room tilt. He gripped the back of a chair for balance, the metallic edge cutting into his palm. Cameras flashed, capturing his downfall from every angle. His disgrace was now part of the public record, a story that would spread through financial networks, newspapers, and online commentary. The man who built an image on invincibility now stood before the world exposed, fragile, and undeniably defeated. Grace's confirmation as interim CEO was met with nods of approval. Reporters whispered about her poise, her intelligence, her quiet mastery of corporate strategy. For years she had been seen as Ethan's elegant but passive wife. Now she was something far greater, a leader stepping into her rightful role. As she concluded her remarks, Grace turned to Ethan with the faintest expression of compassion, not pity. It was the look of someone who saw the human beneath the arrogance, someone who understood the magnitude of loss but would not be burdened by it. Ethan hated that look. It made him feel small. Security entered discreetly, not to escort him forcibly, but to signal the end of his tenure. Ethan attempted to stand tall, but the weight of the moment pulled at his shoulders. As he walked toward the exit, cameras followed mercilessly. The whispers grew louder. Some faces held sympathy, but most held relief. They were witnessing the removal of a liability. Ethan paused at the doorway, glancing back at the room he once commanded. Grace stood at the center, speaking calmly with investors. She belonged there. The realization stung more than any humiliation. The empire he claimed as his own was never his, and the authority he believed he commanded had always belonged to the woman he underestimated. As he stepped into the hallway, the doors closing behind him, Ethan felt the cracks in his life widen into fractures. His company was gone. His reputation was unraveling. His mistress was slipping away. His marriage was ending. And this was only the beginning. Ethan hadn't made it far down the hallway when reporters swarmed, microphones thrust toward him, questions firing like arrows. He attempted to push through, shielding his face from cameras, but the journalists were relentless. They wanted sound bites, explanations, reactions. They wanted to capture the moment the king fell from his throne. Inside the boardroom, the live stream continued. Grace stood before the room, her posture steady as she presented the deed to the mansion, her final piece of evidence. A hush fell over the audience as she laid it on the table, the embossed seal glowing under the lights. The cameras zoomed in, broadcasting the truth to viewers worldwide. The mansion Ethan bragged about, the mansion he threatened to give away to his mistress, the mansion he believed symbolized his power, legally belonged to Grace alone. She explained the protective measures Harold had enacted, ensuring the property could never be transferred or leveraged without her consent. Her words were calm, professional, irrefutable. The boardroom reacted with quiet shock, some murmuring admiration, others exchanging knowing glances. Ethan's collapse was no longer speculation. It was documented reality. Meanwhile, Ethan watched the live stream from a nearby monitor, the room spinning as the truth unfolded publicly. Hearing it privately had been devastating. Seeing it broadcast to investors, reporters, and every member of the financial world was annihilating. He pressed a hand against the wall for support, feeling a sharp ache in his chest. It wasn't physical. It was existential. The camera panned to the deed again, and Ethan saw the handwriting he'd recognized years ago, the signature of Harold Whitmore. The man he once called a mentor, the man whose respect he believed he earned, the man whose wealth he proudly claimed he didn't rely on. Now the truth stood exposed. Harold hadn't believed in Ethan. Harold had protected Grace from him. Grace resumed speaking, explaining that Ethan would vacate the mansion by the end of the week, as stipulated in the prenup clauses Ethan never bothered to read. Her tone remained measured, but the impact was seismic. The reporters outside caught the announcement seconds later. A wave of questions erupted around Ethan, intensifying his panic. He stumbled backward, desperate to escape the cameras. But every hallway held another screen, replaying Grace's words. Every phone buzzed with headlines about his removal. Every whisper felt like judgment. He tried calling Lila, but she didn't answer. He tried calling his CFO, but the call went straight to voicemail. He was alone in a way he had never imagined. In the boardroom, the atmosphere transformed. Grace's authority was undeniable. Investors shook her hand. Analysts complimented the clarity she brought. Even those who once supported Ethan now aligned with her. She was the future. He was the cautionary tale. The camera caught her final statement. This decision is necessary for the stability of the company, the integrity of our legacy, and the responsibility we owe to those who believed in our vision. Grace wasn't claiming victory. She was protecting a kingdom Ethan never understood. As the live stream ended, Ethan sank into a nearby chair, the weight of defeat crushing him. He had spent years building a fantasy of power, a fantasy he shared with his mistress and projected to the world. But fantasies shatter easily when confronted with truth. And today, Grace held the truth in her hands. The deed ended more than his illusions. It ended the life he believed he controlled. When Ethan finally escaped the reporters and found a moment of solitude, his first instinct was to call Lila. She had always been his refuge, the place he ran when he needed admiration. But now, as he stared at his phone, he hesitated longer than he expected. He feared her reaction. He feared she already knew. Still, desperation pushed him to dial her number. It rang once, twice. Then a robotic voice announced that her phone was unavailable. Ethan froze. Lila always answered him. Always. She built her world around his attention. At least, that's what he thought. He called again, and again, each attempt swallowed by the same impersonal message. A dull throb formed at the base of his skull. Something was wrong. Or worse, something was ending. He immediately texted her, demanding she respond. The message delivered, but no reply came. The silence that followed felt heavier than Grace's stillness ever had. This silence held abandonment inside it. Across the city, Lila sat at her kitchen table, phone face down, hands wrapped around a glass of water she hadn't touched. She watched the highlights of the board meeting through trending clips online. The headlines were brutal. Ethan Rockwell removed from his own company. Ethan Rockwell stripped of power. Ethan Rockwell exposed for financial mismanagement. And then the most damning headline of all, Ethan Rockwell attempted to gift a mansion he did not legally own. That headline alone ended whatever fantasy she still held. Lila wasn't vindictive, but she wasn't foolish. She understood opportunity, and more importantly, she recognized instability. Ethan wasn't a king losing his crown. He was a man who never had won. She had invested in his image, not his reality. And now both were collapsing, rapidly and publicly. Her phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages from Ethan lit up the screen. She didn't open them. She didn't need to. She could predict their tone, pleading, defensive, maybe even angry. She knew he would insist things were temporary, that he would regain control, that she should trust him. But Lila had trusted men like him before, and she knew how quickly men who relied on admiration turned cruel when admiration disappeared. She turned off her phone. Back at the summit venue, Ethan paced the hallway like a caged animal. His hands shook. His tie felt too tight. He couldn't understand why Lila would choose this moment to abandon him. He had promised her everything. But as the truth settled, he tried forcing another narrative. Maybe the signal dropped. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she didn't see the news yet. But he knew none of that was true. He pulled up her address on his phone, entering the building with the last threads of his dignity unraveling. The doorman, once eager to please him, now regarded him with polite indifference. Ethan demanded he call up to Lila's unit. The doorman obliged, his voice calm as he spoke into the intercom. No answer. Ethan's chest tightened. He asked him to try again. Still nothing. Finally, the doorman offered the kind of gentle caution reserved for people at the edge of a breakdown. Perhaps she isn't expecting visitors. The words hit harder than any boardroom vote. Ethan stepped back from the desk, his throat burning. He had never felt this kind of abandonment. Grace's silence had irritated him. Lila's silence destroyed him. Because Grace's silence came from power, Lila's came from departure. Ethan had always assumed women needed him, depended on him. But now two women, different in every way, showed him the same truth. He was no longer a man anyone relied on. He left the building, head bowed, unable to deny the truth any longer. Lila was gone. Not because of Grace, not because of the board, but because Ethan had nothing left to offer but promises, and promises don't impress someone who finally sees the truth. As he walked down the street, he realized that the life he'd built was collapsing not from external betrayal, but from the internal emptiness he spent years hiding beneath noise. And now that the noise was gone, there was nothing left. By the next morning, Ethan's downfall dominated every financial news broadcast, social feed, and gossip site. Headlines swirled like vultures circling a wounded creature. Clips from the board meeting played in endless loops, each frame dissected by commentators eager to explain how a man once considered bold had actually been reckless, how his so-called genius was propped up by silent investors, how his own signature had sealed his fate. Ethan watched it all from his penthouse, pacing in front of the giant windows that once made him feel invincible. Today, the view mocked him. The city glittered beneath him, indifferent to his humiliation. He muted one broadcast, only for another notification to flash across his phone. Grace Whitmore Rockwell praised for poised leadership transition. Another one followed. Rockwell investors rallied behind Grace's strategic vision. Then another. Experts say Ethan's removal was overdue. Ethan felt sick. The world wasn't sympathizing with him. They were analyzing him, dismantling him, reducing his legacy to a cautionary tale. Every sentence cut deeper than the last. He had lived his life demanding admiration, shaping his identity around the need to be seen as extraordinary. But now, people viewed him clearly for the first time, and they didn't like what they saw. He turned off the television, but the silence was worse. Silence forced him to confront the truth. His phone buzzed repeatedly, messages from former colleagues, old acquaintances, journalists pretending to be friends. Some expressed concern. Most asked for statements. Ethan ignored them all. Hours passed. The news cycle intensified. Analysts discussed every misstep. They highlighted the mansion fiasco, replaying the moment Grace presented the deed. They showed footage of Ethan trying to speak, his voice cracking under pressure. They invited experts to speculate on his finances, his future, his emotional stability. Then came the worst segment of all. Where did Ethan Rockwell go wrong? A panel of commentators outlined a timeline of his failures. His overextension, his dependency on silent investors, his abrasive leadership style, his refusal to hire competent advisors, his impulsive decisions, his public disrespect of Grace. They concluded that none of this happened overnight. Ethan had been falling for years. Today simply made it visible. He shut off the TV again, his hands trembling. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to reclaim the narrative. But he no longer had a platform. No one wanted to hear excuses. Everyone wanted Grace. Investors praised her. Media respected her. She had become the symbol of stability he pretended to be. He poured a drink, then another, pacing as the sky darkened outside. The city lights blurred through the glass. He replayed moments from his marriage. Times he dismissed Grace's intelligence. Times he mocked her silence. Times he believed she clung to him for relevance. He saw now how wrong he had been. She hadn't clung to him. She had studied him. And in studying him, she saw everything he refused to see about himself. As he drank, another headline appeared. Grace Whitmore announces new philanthropic initiative amid leadership change. The contrast was brutal. While Ethan spiraled, Grace thrived. He sank onto the couch, the weight of his downfall pressing heavily on him. The man the world once praised was now the man they couldn't stop dissecting. The more he tried to escape the coverage, the more unavoidable it became. And deep within the silence of his penthouse, Ethan realized something painful. Grace didn't need to destroy him. He had handed the world the pieces. They simply arranged them into a story he could no longer escape. The penthouse that once felt like a monument to Ethan's success now felt cavernous and cold. Every polished surface reflected the emptiness inside him. He moved from room to room like a man walking through the remnants of a life he no longer recognized. The furniture felt expensive but meaningless. The art felt impressive but hollow. Everything he once displayed as proof of greatness now served as evidence of illusion. His phone buzzed with new notifications, more headlines, more commentary, more speculation. Ethan silenced it. He didn't want to read about himself anymore. He didn't want to see the world celebrating Grace's rise. He didn't want to confront the truth that his penthouse, like the rest of his image, existed on borrowed time. A letter from his landlord lay on the table, informing him that his lease renewal was under review due to concerns about his liquidity. Liquidity. The word stung. He had once lectured others about liquidity. Now it was the very thing slipping through his fingers. Ethan collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. He thought of the mansion, Grace's mansion. He thought of Lila, gone without a trace. He thought of his company, no longer his. He thought of Grace's expression when she faced him in the boardroom, calm, confident, resolute. He had never feared silence until now. In the dim light of evening, Ethan packed a single suitcase. He didn't know where he would go next. He only knew he couldn't stay here, not in this monument to failure, not in this echo chamber of everything he lost. As he zipped the suitcase shut, he finally understood his life's most painful truth. He had built an empire on noise, and now that the noise was gone, there was nothing left to hold it together. Grace returned to the mansion the next morning with a sense of finality resting on her shoulders, not heavy, but resolute. Today marked the moment she would reclaim not just the property that legally belonged to her, but the identity she had quietly protected for years. She had lived in the shadows of Ethan's noise, absorbing his self-centered monologues, enduring his demeaning comments, and allowing him to believe he dominated the narrative. But as she stepped through the grand doors, a sunlight streak washed across the marble floors as if the house itself welcomed her home. The staff greeted her with soft relief, as though they too sensed the shift in power. They had always respected Grace, quietly observing her dignity through years of turbulence. Now they saw her in her rightful place, no longer suppressed by Ethan's theatrics, but rising with the grace and precision her lineage intended. Grace walked through each room deliberately, not to admire wealth, but to recenter the home around her. She entered the solarium, the crown jewel of the estate, and paused among the plants her mother once nurtured. The room felt like a memory preserved in glass. Today, it would become a sanctuary again, not for escape, but for leadership. She called a brief meeting with the house manager, confirming the transition plan. Ethan would collect his personal items from the guest suite, not the master bedroom. His access would be revoked by the end of the week. Locks would be changed. Security updated. Grace made each decision not with bitterness, but with practicality. She owed him professionalism, nothing more. As she reviewed paperwork in the study, her phone buzzed with a message from a journalist requesting an exclusive interview. Grace declined. She wasn't interested in spectacle. The public didn't need her commentary. They needed her consistency. Ethan had always chased the spotlight. Grace preferred results. In the afternoon, she walked along the balcony overlooking the garden. Harold's note echoed in her mind. This home is your shield. She understood it fully now. The mansion wasn't a symbol of wealth. It was a symbol of continuity. A fortress that kept her steady through Ethan's storms. And now, standing above the grounds that belonged to her in name and bloodline, she felt Harold's foresight surround her. Her thoughts drifted briefly to Ethan, not with longing, but with neutrality. He had always needed the house to validate himself. He needed the grandeur, the glamour, the illusions of power. But Grace had never relied on walls or chandeliers to define her worth. The power she held came from within, cultivated quietly, revealed only when necessary. As the sun began to set, casting warm amber hues across the estate, Grace gathered the final documents for tomorrow's transition meeting. Her leadership would begin in earnest. She felt ready, not because she craved authority, but because she was stepping into the role she had trained for through years of silence and observation. She closed the balcony doors gently, whispering a final goodbye, not to Ethan, but to the version of herself who had once tolerated him. That woman was gone now. In her place stood someone stronger, clearer, more certain of her purpose. Grace descended the staircase, feeling the mansion settle into alignment around her. For the first time in a long time, the home felt like hers again. Tomorrow, the world would see her rise. But tonight, the mansion already had. Ethan lingered at the edge of his penthouse, suitcase by his feet, avoiding the mirror across the room. His reflection had become an enemy lately, an unwelcome reminder of the man he once pretended to be. He used to admire the sharpness of his suit, the firmness of his jawline, the manufactured confidence in his posture. But now, looking at himself felt like staring at a hollowed-out version of a myth. He checked his phone again. No messages from Lila. No updates from investors. His inbox overflowed with requests for statements he refused to give. He wasn't ready to speak. He wasn't ready to accept. He wasn't ready to admit, even privately, that Grace had dismantled his life by simply revealing it. He wandered through the penthouse one last time. The more he looked, the more he realized how little of it reflected him. No personal history, no real connections, just the empty symbols of someone trying to project dominance. A carefully arranged life with nothing supporting it. Financial alerts continued buzzing through his phone. His accounts were still restricted. His credit lines suspended. His liquidity questioned. His reputation deteriorating by the hour. Ethan wanted to believe it was temporary, but he sensed the truth pressing against his chest. Without Grace's silent support, the financial world saw him clearly. Too risky, too unstable, too loud. He made his way to the elevator, suitcase trailing behind him. As the doors closed, he saw his reflection once more. Small, tired, unrecognizable. He looked away. The building lobby was quieter than usual. People who once greeted him enthusiastically now offered polite, restrained nods. Some looked through him. Others avoided his gaze entirely. His fall wasn't just corporate. It was social. The same people who once sought his favor now kept their distance. Failure spreads like contagion in the elite world, and Ethan was now a symbol of it. Outside, the cold air stung his face. He climbed into a rideshare, something he hadn't done in years, and gave the driver Grace's address. He told himself he needed closure. He told himself he needed to retrieve his belongings. But deep down, he was searching for something else. Maybe dignity. Maybe redemption. Maybe the version of himself he lost somewhere between ambition and delusion. As the car approached the mansion gates, Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He realized he had no claim here anymore. The house was not his. The life inside it was not his. And the woman who lived there had outgrown him long before today. He stepped out slowly, suitcase in hand, staring at the mansion as if seeing it for the first time, not as a stage, but as a fortress he never truly entered. He rang the bell. He waited. He wondered whether Grace would open the door herself, or whether the staff would. He wondered whether she would look at him with anger, pity, or indifference. But above all, he wondered what he would see reflected in her eyes. And he feared the answer. Grace stood in the foyer as the doorbell echoed through the mansion. She knew who it was without needing confirmation. Ethan's arrival felt like the final thread pulling taut before snapping completely. She signaled the house manager to open the door, not because she couldn't face him, but because this meeting was not emotional. It was procedural. Ethan entered with forced composure, suitcase rolling behind him. He glanced around the foyer as though expecting some part of it to acknowledge him. It didn't. The mansion felt colder toward him now, unmoved by his presence. Grace stepped forward, poised and calm. Ethan's eyes flickered with something between hope and fear. He opened his mouth, but she raised a hand gently, not to silence him rudely, but to guide the moment. This wasn't a confrontation. It was closure. She informed him that his belongings had been packed and placed in the guest suite. The staff would assist him if needed. He nodded stiffly, humiliation tightening his posture. He searched her face, looking for softness, anger, anything familiar. But what he found was composure. Grace wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't vindictive. She was simply finished. Ethan attempted small talk, desperate to delay the inevitable. He tried to frame his downfall as temporary, insisting he would rebuild. But Grace did not respond to the facade. She listened without reacting, her silence exposing every weakness in his words. When he finally asked if she planned to give statements to the press about him, Grace answered with gentle clarity. She had no interest in publicly humiliating him. His downfall was not her victory. Her victory was reclaiming her life. Ethan flinched. He expected fury. He expected gloating. Instead, he received indifference, the most painful response of all. Grace walked him to the base of the staircase, her presence steady and dignified. She reminded him that his access to the estate would end tonight. He nodded numbly, the finality settling like lead in his chest. As he gathered the last of his belongings, Ethan took a slow look around the mansion, seeing it without filters, without ego, without illusion. It was beautiful. It was powerful. It was Grace's. It always had been. Grace escorted him to the door. He paused, perhaps wanting to apologize, perhaps wanting forgiveness, perhaps wanting the past to feel less broken. But Grace's expression ended his search. She didn't hate him. She simply didn't need him. He stepped outside, the cold air brushing against his face as the door closed behind him with a soft but undeniable finality. The man who once dominated this mansion now stood on the outside, and the woman he once underestimated stood firmly within. Grace stood at the balcony overlooking the gardens as dawn spread across the estate. The soft light bathed the mansion in gold, illuminating the place that had weathered storms, sheltered history, and witnessed the quiet rise of a woman underestimated for far too long. Today was the beginning, not of revenge, but of renewal. In the distance, she could hear the faint hum of press vans gathering beyond the gates. They weren't here for Ethan anymore. They were here for her. Investors wanted statements. Analysts wanted insight. The world wanted to understand the woman who dismantled an empire with documents and composure instead of noise and chaos. Grace breathed deeply, feeling neither pressure nor fear. She felt alignment. She felt destiny. Inside, the mansion buzzed softly with motion. Staff prepared for the day with a sense of respect that had always been present, but today carried new meaning. They weren't serving Ethan's ego anymore. They were supporting Grace's leadership. She entered the solarium, sunlight touching her face as she reviewed the final documents for the morning's press briefing. Harold's pin shimmered faintly near her collar. She placed a steady hand over it, grounding herself in the legacy she now carried forward. The world would soon hear her story, not the version Ethan tried to write, but the truth she lived. Down the driveway, a single car rolled away from the estate. Ethan, suitcase in the back, shoulders slumped. A silhouette of a man who once believed power came from volume, now learning it comes from integrity and foresight. Grace didn't watch the car with triumph. She watched it with closure. He had written the end of their marriage the moment he slammed those divorce papers on the table. What he didn't realize was that he also wrote the beginning of her ascent. She turned away from the window, ready to face the day. Grace Whitmore Rockwell was done being silent, and the world was finally ready to hear her.